A song from the past. The warm golden glow of Le Chateau, one of New York's finest restaurants, bathed the room in an air of power and prestige. Jared Whitmore sat at the head of an expensive polished table, his sharp blue eyes sweeping over the men seated before him. These weren't just business partners. They were titans of industry, men who moved millions with a handshake, who decided the fate of companies with a signature. Tonight was supposed to be another calculated victory, another step toward expanding Whitmore Enterprises, the empire he had spent the last decade building from nothing. Numbers were exchanged, contracts dissected, strategies debated, and as always, Jared held all the winning moves. But then, a sound, a melody. Soft at first, barely a whisper against the hum of conversation. Jared didn't register it right away. It was just a song, just background noise drifting in from the streets beyond the towering glass windows. Then, a voice joined the melody. Delicate, pure, and unmistakably familiar. Jared froze. His fingers clenched around the stem of his wine glass, his pulse slamming against his ribs. It wasn't possible. That song, that voice. Do you remember this song, Jared? The memory hit him with the force of a hurricane. Alexis, the love of his life, the woman who had vanished without a trace 10 years ago. She used to hum that song while making coffee in their tiny Chicago apartment. She'd dance barefoot on the hardwood floor, a half-tied apron hanging loosely around her frame. Remember, this is our song. Jared's breath turned shallow. His chair scraped against the marble floor as he pushed it back, startling the investors mid-conversation. Mr. Whitmore, one of them asked, puzzled by his sudden shift in demeanor. But Jared didn't hear them anymore. The millions of dollars at stake, the strategic partnerships, irrelevant. I need a moment, he muttered, his tone clipped and firm, allowing no room for argument. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the restaurant's entrance, past rows of polished silverware and pristine white tablecloths, past waitstaff who whispered as they saw the unshakable Jared Whitmore moving with an urgency they had never witnessed before. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a shockwave. New York buzzed around him, neon lights reflecting off rain-slicked pavement, the distant hum of life moving on unaware of the storm brewing inside him. And then he saw them. A small group of street musicians gathered just beyond the restaurant's terrace. A pianist, a guitarist, and standing in the center, a boy. The boy with the familiar song. Jared came to an abrupt halt. The child, no older than 10, gripped the microphone with surprising confidence. He wasn't just singing, he was feeling the song, pouring emotion into every note, as if the words had been etched into his soul. But it wasn't just the song. It was the silver necklace hanging around the boy's neck. A simple pendant, unremarkable to most. But to Jared, it was everything. A cold, sharp pressure settled in his chest. He took a shaky step forward, his breath hitching as the pendant glinted under the streetlights. He knew that necklace, because he had designed it. For Alexis. A decade ago, he had placed it around her neck himself, fastening the delicate chain while she laughed, teasing him for being so sentimental. "Now you can never lose me," she had whispered. And then she was gone. For years, Jared had searched, hired detectives, followed dead-end leads, chased shadows, and now, a boy was wearing her necklace. The street performance ended, and the small crowd clapped politely before dispersing. The boy gave a slight bow, tucking the microphone under his arm. Jared didn't move. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. The boy finally noticed him. Curiosity flickered across his face, quickly replaced by mild caution. He was used to people stopping to listen, but there was something different about this man. Something in Jared's intensity made him hesitate. Jared took a step closer, his voice tight with restraint. "That song," he said. "Where did you learn it?" The boy hesitated, shifting on his feet. He glanced at his bandmates, as if seeking reassurance, before returning his gaze to Jared. "My mom taught it to me." Jared's world tilted. His breath came sharper, quicker, as he struggled to process the words. "Your mom," he repeated, almost as if testing the weight of them. The boy nodded. Jared swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What's her name?" The boy studied him for a long moment before answering. "Brianna." A name that meant nothing to him. And yet, something inside Jared snapped. The world blurred. The streetlights, the passing cars, the distant laughter of strangers. It didn't make sense. Alexis had disappeared without a trace. No clues. No explanations. No leads. And yet, here stood this boy, singing her song, wearing her necklace, carrying a piece of her as if she had never truly been gone. Jared's fingers curled into fists. He had spent a decade chasing ghosts, but now, he was standing right in front of one. He forced his breath to steady. "The necklace," he said, his voice quieter now. "Where did you get it?" The boy's fingers instinctively wrapped around the pendant, gripping it protectively. "It was my mom's," he said, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. "She gave it to me when I turned 5. 5 years ago." Jared's mind raced, calculating the timeline. If this boy was 10, and Alexis had vanished 10 years ago, his heart slammed against his ribs. It couldn't be. Jared took a careful step forward, forcing himself to keep his voice calm. "Your mom," he started carefully. "Was she always called Brianna?" The boy frowned. His expression shifted slightly. "Of course," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty now. Jared shook his head. "She wasn't." The words came out almost as a whisper. And for the first time, the boy looked uncertain. Jared didn't push. He knew better than to demand answers, especially from a child who had no reason to trust him. Instead, he softened his voice, keeping his tone gentle, steady. "May I meet your mother?" The boy hesitated, his fingers curling around the strap of his worn-out backpack. His instincts told him to be cautious. His mother had always warned him about strangers. But there was something different about this man. Something about his voice didn't sound like a lie. The boy's jaw tightened. "Why?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Jared exhaled slowly, aware that every word mattered now. "I knew your mother," he admitted. "A long time ago." The boy hesitated, his grip on the necklace tightening. Jared let the weight of the moment settle, before adding the only truth that mattered. "I've been searching for her ever since." The boy studied him for a moment longer, considering. Finally, with the kind of carefulness only a child who had seen too much could possess, he nodded. "Okay," he said, "but you can't tell her I brought you." Jared swallowed hard. "I promise." And just like that, a decade-old mystery was about to unravel. The woman who forgot herself. The boy led Jared Whitmore through the winding streets of New York, weaving through bustling sidewalks and dimly lit alleys. The glow of the city flickered against wet pavement, reflecting in puddles like fractured pieces of a dream. Jared's heart pounded in his chest, not from the fast pace, but from the sheer weight of the moment. For 10 years, he had searched for Alexis. For 10 years, he had chased shadows, dead ends, and false hope. And now, he was about to walk into a reality he wasn't sure he was ready for. An unexpected destination. The neighborhood the boy led him into was nothing like the world Jared lived in. Gone were the towering glass buildings, the luxury storefronts, the fine dining restaurants with valet service. Here, the sidewalks were cracked, the buildings aged and weary, and graffiti stretched across brick walls like whispers of forgotten voices. It was a place Jared had never set foot in before, a place he had never even considered existed within his city. And yet, it was here that she had been living. The boy stopped in front of a rundown apartment complex. The exterior was faded, the metal railing leading up to the entrance rusted with years of neglect. The building stood quiet, save for the occasional muffled conversation, or the distant echo of a siren. Jared hesitated for only a moment before following the boy inside. The air smelled of old wood, metal, and a faint trace of lavender. A scent that sent a shiver through him, because Alexis had always loved lavender. Everything around him was foreign, but something in his chest tightened with a feeling he couldn't quite name. It was almost like home. The photograph that changed everything. The apartment was small, cramped even, but it was immaculately kept. Everything had a place. Every surface had been wiped clean. There was a certain carefulness to the space, as if someone had worked tirelessly to maintain order in a life that had so little of it. Jared's eyes scanned the room, taking in the mismatched furniture, the worn-out but carefully folded blankets, and the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. His chest tightened. This was where she had been. This was what her life had become. Then, his gaze landed on something that made his breath hitch. A small wooden table sat against the far wall, cluttered with a few books, a cheap alarm clock, and a single framed photograph. Jared crossed the room without thinking. His fingers ghosted over the edges of the frame, his pulse roaring in his ears. It was her. Alexis. Her hair was shorter now, pulled into a loose ponytail. She was wearing a simple blouse, her arms wrapped around the boy standing beside her. She looked different, older, tired, like someone who had been lost and remade into someone else. But it was her. Jared's fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the frame, his throat dry. The doorknob twisted behind him. The sound of keys jangling broke the silence. Jared froze. The front door creaked open. And for the first time in 10 years, he saw her, the woman who didn't recognize him. She stepped inside, setting down a bag of groceries before pausing mid-step. She stiffened. Her entire body went rigid as her gaze landed on him. Her eyes met his, dark and guarded. There was no flicker of recognition, no sharp intake of breath, no shock, only quiet suspicion. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was sharp, defensive. Nothing like the warm, teasing tone he remembered. Jared felt like the floor had been ripped out from beneath him. For years, he had imagined this moment. He had thought about what he would say, how he would tell her how much he had searched, how he had never stopped believing she was out there somewhere. But now, none of it mattered. She didn't know him, a name she had forgotten. Jared turned toward the boy, who had stepped into the room behind her, watching the interaction silently. "Harry," she said, her tone shifting, more maternal now. "Who is this?" The boy hesitated. He glanced at Jared, then back at his mother. "An old friend." She scoffed, shaking her head. "I think you have the wrong person," she said, moving past Jared as if he were a stranger. "I don't have any old friends." Jared swallowed hard. He took a slow step forward, his voice careful, steady. "Alexis." She stilled, but her expression didn't change. "You have the wrong person," she repeated, her tone measured. "My name is Brianna." Jared felt the world tilt. No, that wasn't true. She was Alexis Carter. They were engaged 10 years ago. She had disappeared without a trace. And now she was standing here, looking at him like a stranger. Jared shook his head. "That's not your name," he said, his voice raw. "You're Alexis Carter." She took a step back, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jared exhaled sharply. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out something he had carried for a decade. A photograph, one of the few he had left of them together. And a small velvet box. Inside it, a ring, her engagement ring. He placed them both on the table before her. She stared at them. She stared at herself in the photograph. She stared at the ring she once wore. Her fingers twitched, as if reaching for something familiar but foreign. Then, her breath hitched. Her hand shot to her temple as if in pain. A flash of something crossed her face. A white dress. A voice whispering her name. Warm fingers intertwined with hers. A memory locked away. Her lips parted. But just as quickly as it came, it disappeared. She blinked, her expression blank again. "I don't know you." Jared felt the words like a punch to the gut. But deep in his chest, he knew. She did. She just didn't remember yet. And he was going to help her find her way back. A promise to the past. Jared stepped back, his voice gentle but firm. "You do remember," he murmured. "Don't you?" She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands trembling. But when she opened them again, her face was a mask. "I think you should leave," she said. Jared exhaled slowly. He nodded. But before he stepped out the door, he turned to Harry. "Take care of your mom," he said softly. Harry nodded. And as Jared walked away, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The line barely rang twice before a voice answered. "Jared?" He took a deep breath. "I found her." And just like that, the fight for the truth had begun. The truth that couldn't stay buried. Jared Whitmore had spent 10 years chasing ghosts. Tonight, he had finally found one. But she didn't remember him. She didn't remember herself. And as much as it shattered him to his core, he wasn't walking away. Because deep down, beneath the layers of forgotten memories and a life rebuilt under a different name, Alexis was still there, and he was going to bring her back. A call to the past. Jared's car idled at the curb, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the phone rang in his ear. The voice on the other end answered almost immediately. "Jared?" Jared exhaled sharply. "I found her." A pause. Then, "You're sure?" Jared ran a hand through his hair, staring at the apartment building in his rearview mirror. "She's alive. But she doesn't remember me. Doesn't remember anything." Another pause. Then, "She will." The certainty in his friend's voice settled something inside him. Because that was the thing about memories. They never really disappeared. They just needed to be unlocked. And Jared was going to find the key. The woman in the photograph. Over the next several weeks, Jared did something he had never done before. He watched. He waited. And he learned who Alexis had become. Or rather, who she thought she was. She lived a quiet life now. Simple. Small. She worked as a music teacher at a community center, spending her days helping kids, her evenings humming familiar tunes she didn't know were part of another life. She was still kind, still gentle, still strong. She just didn't know where she had come from. And Harry, the boy who had unknowingly led Jared to her, was her world. Jared never approached her. Not yet. Because forcing the truth on her wouldn't bring her back. She had to find it herself. And so he waited. Until one night, the past came knocking. A song she shouldn't remember. It was a Friday evening when it happened. Jared had returned to Le Chateau, the restaurant where this all began. He wasn't there for business. Not anymore. He was there because Harry had begun singing there every weekend, his voice drawing in crowds, his small band gaining popularity. Jared sat in the back, unnoticed. But tonight was different. Because tonight, when Harry began to sing, something changed. A soft gasp from behind him. A sharp intake of breath. Jared turned and saw her, standing near the entrance, her body frozen, her face pale. Her eyes were wide, locked onto Harry like she had just seen a ghost. Because the song he was singing was hers. Memories unraveling. Jared watched as her breathing quickened. Her fingers pressed against her temples, as if something inside her was breaking open. She turned, pushing through the crowd, stumbling into the street. Jared followed. "Alexis." She whipped around. "My name is Brianna," she snapped, her voice shaking. Jared stopped. "No, it's not," he said softly. Something inside her cracked. Her hands trembled. The memories were fighting their way back. She shook her head violently. "I don't know you." Jared took a slow, careful step forward. "But you do," he whispered. Her breathing was shallow now. Her lips parted like she was gasping for air. "You disappeared," Jared continued. 10 years ago. I searched for you. I never stopped." Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I don't remember." Jared reached into his pocket and pulled out the engagement ring. She stared at it, her entire body rigid. And then, a tear slipped down her cheek. The past comes rushing back. She didn't know what happened first, the wave of memories or the dizzying sensation that came with them. But suddenly, she was somewhere else. A Chicago apartment, a man holding her hand, a song playing softly in the background. Laughter, promises whispered against the night air. Her mind spiraled, the memories crashing into her one by one. The accident, the confusion, the voices of strangers telling her she was someone else. The fear, the feeling of something missing. Him, Jared. Her knees buckled, and suddenly he was there, catching her before she could fall. She looked up at him, and for the first time in a decade, she knew him. "Jared," she whispered. His hands tightened around her arms, his own eyes glassy with emotion. "Yeah, Lex," he breathed. Her lips parted in a quiet sob as realization crashed into her. "I forgot you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jared shook his head, cupping her face gently. "It doesn't matter," he murmured. "You're here now." A future rekindled. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Tears, laughter, the slow, painful process of remembering. Alexis didn't get everything back at once, but piece by piece, she found herself again. She remembered the life they had planned. She remembered the love they had built. And most of all, she remembered why she had fought so hard to survive. And as she sat on a park bench with Jared one evening, watching Harry play on the swings, she exhaled softly. "So what now?" she asked. Jared smiled. "Now," he echoed.